On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of Russian aristocrats invited a man to a private dinner in a basement in St. Petersburg. They fed him cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. He ate the cakes, he drank the wine, he kept talking. One of the men, in a panic, pulled out a revolver and shot him in the chest. He fell. They thought he was dead. He got back up and tried to escape into the courtyard. They shot him again and again. They beat him. They wrapped him in a curtain. They drove him to a frozen river and threw him through a hole in the ice. When his body was recovered days later, the autopsy reportedly found water in his lungs. He may have still been alive when he went into the river. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and the story of how hard he was to kill has become one of the most famous legends in Russian history. Some of it is true. Some of it isn't. Let's sort out which is which. To understand why a group of Russian nobles decided that murdering this man was worth the risk of treason, you need to understand who Rasputin actually was and how he ended up with more influence over the Russian royal family than most of the government. Grigory Rasputin was born around 1869 in a small Siberian village to a peasant family. He had almost no formal education. As a young man, he had a reputation for heavy drinking and general misbehavior. Not exactly the resume of someone destined to become one of the most influential figures in the final years of the Russian Empire. At some point in his 20s, Rasputin underwent what he described as a religious awakening. He left his village, wandered as a pilgrim, and eventually associated himself loosely with a mystical strain of Russian Orthodox spirituality. He was never formally ordained as a monk or priest. He was, more accurately, a wandering holy man, the kind of self-styled mystic that Imperial Russia produced with some regularity. What set Rasputin apart was not theological sophistication, it was charisma. People who met him described an intensity in his presence, piercing eyes, an ability to make people feel he was speaking directly and only to them, a magnetic quality that is difficult to fully explain from historical descriptions, but was clearly, by all contemporary accounts, extremely real. He made his way to St. Petersburg around 1903 and began building a reputation as a healer and spiritual advisor among the city's aristocracy, who had a considerable appetite at the time for mysticism, spiritualism, and alternative religious experiences. In 1905, he was introduced to Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. This introduction changed everything. The royal couple had a son, Alexei, born in 1904, who was the heir to the Russian throne. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that meant even minor injuries could cause dangerous, uncontrollable bleeding. In an era with no effective treatment for hemophilia, this was a constant, terrifying threat to the life of the future Tsar. Alexandra, desperate and increasingly isolated in her fear for her son's life, turned to Rasputin. And here is the part of the story that is genuinely difficult to explain, regardless of what you believe about the supernatural. On multiple documented occasions when Alexei was in medical crisis, bleeding that doctors could not stop, Rasputin was brought in and the boy's condition reportedly improved. Modern historians have offered various explanations. Some suggest Rasputin's calming presence reduced Alexei's stress, and stress can worsen bleeding episodes. Some suggest Rasputin advised removing the aspirin-based medications doctors of the era commonly prescribed, medications that we now know thin the blood and would have made hemophilia symptoms significantly worse. Whatever the actual mechanism, the effect on Alexandra was total and immediate faith. Rasputin became, for the Tsarina, irreplaceable. She believed genuinely and completely that her son's life depended on this man. This gave Rasputin extraordinary access to the royal family, and, by extension, informal influence over Russian politics that alarmed nearly everyone in the aristocracy and government. By the 1910s, rumors about Rasputin were everywhere. Some were almost certainly true. Reports of heavy drinking, a reputation for scandalous behavior, and using his royal connections for personal gain. Some were wildly exaggerated or entirely fabricated by political enemies. It became genuinely difficult, and remains difficult for historians today, to separate Rasputin's actual behavior from the propaganda deliberately spread to discredit him. What is not disputed is that by 1916, in the middle of World War I, with Russia suffering catastrophic military losses and mounting domestic crisis, Rasputin had become a symbol. To much of the Russian public and aristocracy, he represented everything rotten about the monarchy. A peasant mystic, with the ear of the Tsarina, seemingly running the country from the shadows while soldiers died at the front. Whether Rasputin actually had significant political influence, or whether he was simply a convenient scapegoat for a monarchy already collapsing under its own weight, remains debated. But by December 1916, a group of conspirators had decided he needed to die. The plot was led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, along with Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the royal family himself, and a right-wing politician named Vladimir Purishkevich. Their plan, according to the accounts that survive, almost entirely from Yusupov's own later memoirs, which historians treat with significant skepticism, was to lure Rasputin to Yusupov's palace under the pretense of a private social visit, poison him, and dispose of the body. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to verify with certainty, because our primary source is a man with every incentive to tell a dramatic, self-serving version of events. According to Yusupov's account, Rasputin was given cakes and wine laced with potassium cyanide, enough theoretically to kill several men almost instantly. And according to Yusupov, Rasputin ate and drank for hours, seemingly unaffected. Modern toxicologists and historians have raised serious doubts about this part of the story. Cyanide degrades over time and loses potency, particularly in sugar, which can actually neutralize it. It's entirely possible the poison used was old, improperly stored, or simply insufficient. It's also possible Yusupov exaggerated or invented the poisoning entirely to make his story more dramatic. What happened next is somewhat better documented, though still contested. Yusupov, apparently panicking that the poison wasn't working, retrieved a revolver and shot Rasputin. Rasputin fell. The conspirators believed him dead and left the room. According to the legend, Rasputin then got up and attempted to flee through the courtyard, prompting Purishkevich to shoot him multiple more times. Whether this dramatic resurrection actually happened as described, or whether the first shot was simply not immediately fatal, and Rasputin's death throes were later mythologized into a heroic escape attempt, is genuinely unclear from the historical record. What we know with more confidence is that Rasputin's body, recovered from the Malaya Nevka River days later, showed signs consistent with having been beaten, shot multiple times, and bound before being placed in the water. The claim that water was found in his lungs, suggesting he was still breathing when submerged, comes from a since disputed autopsy report, and modern historians are divided on whether this detail is accurate or another embellishment added to the legend over the following century. Here is the uncomfortable truth about the Rasputin assassination story. Much of what most people know. The impossible resistance to poison, the impossible resistance to bullets, dying only by drowning, comes from a single unreliable narrator with obvious motivation to make himself the hero of a dramatic tale. Yusupov's accounts of the murder changed multiple times over the following decades, each version growing somewhat more elaborate than the last. Rasputin was, almost certainly, simply a man who was poisoned, shot several times, and killed through a combination of violence that would have killed anyone. The mythology of his supernatural resilience was constructed, largely after the fact, by the very people who killed him. because a story about ordinary murderers who needed 4 separate attempts to kill one man is far less flattering than a story about brave conspirators overcoming an almost demonic force of nature. The murder did not save the Russian monarchy. Nicholas II abdicated less than 3 months later. The Romanov dynasty, which the conspirators believed Rasputin was single-handedly destroying, collapsed anyway. And the Tsar and his entire family were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries within 18 months of Rasputin's death. Killing the mystic did not save the monarchy he supposedly controlled. It simply removed him a few months before the whole system collapsed regardless. His name was Grigory Rasputin. The legend says he could not be killed. The truth is probably simpler and somehow sadder. He was killed exactly like anyone else would have been. It just took men who had never actually murdered anyone before for separate attempts to admit that to themselves.